Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I'm also someone who happens to hold a secondary education teaching credential. I put it to good use as soon as I graduated from college. I landed myself a job at a Benedictine boys' boarding school. I was teaching 11th grade English and all levels of Spanish, and I thought what would be better than teaching those boys Huckleberry Finn. It was my first experience with the novel, and in some ways I really appreciated it. In others, I understood the difficulties. We really carefully read it as a satire. So, I had very firmly in hand this idea that Mark Twain was in fact criticizing slavery in lots of different ways. But I did not, in fact, anticipate that half of the class, in fact, slightly more than half of the class, were boys who were at the boarding school from Hong Kong. And let me tell you, Mark Twain's very liberal use of the vernacular, of all of those dialects in Huckleberry Finn, made it very difficult for those boys. And honestly, I think it was just an absolute grueling year for them, and maybe not my best choice as a secondary school teacher. So I was really excited about the idea of returning to the book. Those of you who've listened to the Fox Page recently know that we're kind of deep into the adaptations at the moment, or re-envisionings, or rewritings, however you want to think of them. Of course, during Jane Austen Week recently, we took a good look at 3 of the rewritings of Pride and Prejudice. And before that, one of the most popular lectures here at the Foxed Page was a very close look at why knowing a little bit about David Copperfield would really, in fact, enhance your understanding of Demon Copperhead. I really, really enjoyed that deep dive into both Dickens and Barbara Kingsolver. So I was very excited about the idea of diving back into a 19th century novel and its contemporary re-envisioning. Little did I know that James was going to be so incredibly, incredibly affecting. I was so moved by this book. I actually read it very quickly, in part because it really clips along, but also because I was just absolutely engrossed in the voice and in the language and in just the virtuosity on the part of Percival Everett. I had never read anything by him before, and let me tell you, James will not be the last book that I have read by Percival Everett. What an absolute literary genius. So my experience of reading James was also deeply inflected by the fact that I was listening to Huckleberry Finn read by Elijah Wood. And so I had both of the novels going sort of simultaneously. Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain was always a bit ahead. I had begun it before I began James. But it was a really interesting experience to have both of those novels going at the same time. So I actually would recommend that. I absolutely think James stands on its own. I do not think that you need to have recently reread Huckleberry Finn, but I have to say that I really did enjoy reading Huckleberry Finn more than I thought I would. At the end, I got very, very frustrated, and in fact was so kind of distracted and so kind of dismayed by what was happening in Huckleberry Finn that I found the end of the novel kind of difficult. But up until that point, I really had sort of new appreciation for what it is that Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, is trying to do with the novel. So I hope that today, as we look at both Huckleberry Finn and James together, that we'll have a really interesting interplay between the two. And even if you are not planning on diving back into Huckleberry Finn, I'll be able to give you a little appreciation of how an understanding of the two novels is really going to enrich your experience of James. Those of you who like an agenda, here is the agenda. We're going to start with a brief biography of Percival Everett, as we usually do. Then I'm going to give you some context. We're going to look at, very briefly, at the adventures of Tom Sawyer, at Huckleberry Finn. It's interesting, it's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and then Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Then we're going to dive into James, the text. We'll move on to talk about narrative voice. We're going to talk about language because it is absolutely fundamental in this book. And Everett is doing some really interesting things with language that I think as the reader, you might sort of overlook if you don't sort of slow down and really think about what it is, like this feat that he is pulling off with the novel. We're going to talk about irony. We're going to talk about his insanely great humor. The book is so dark in some ways, but it is so incredibly funny. And it's actually my favorite kind of humor because it's a very dry, very often sort of sarcastic. It's a very kind of subtle and complex and just really, really deft humor. I loved the humor in the book. We're going to talk about the importance of intertexts, which are simply all of the different titles that Percival Everett is bringing to James. Then we're going to talk briefly about the different ways that James is sort of answering some of the questions that come up in Huckleberry Finn, and also how this novel, how Percival Everett clarifies some of the sort of weird things that are happening in Huckleberry Finn. There will not be any spoilers until the very end, when there are going to be some gigantic spoilers. So I will warn you before we get to that point, but I really was so moved and so struck by a few of the revelations that come toward the end of the novel that I really wanted to visit those. So anyone who has finished the novel and is coming to this lecture, having completed this incredible journey, look forward to a quick analysis of what is happening at the end. But again, I will certainly warn you so you can just hit pause and then come back later after you have finished the book. Okay, I want to dive in with a quick look at the biography of Percival Everett. So Everett was born in 1956 in Georgia. He was raised for the most part in South Carolina. His father was in the Army, and he was the eldest of several children. Again, most of my biographical information is going to come from Wikipedia. So this is stuff that's very easily accessible, but I'm doing a little bit of the legwork for you. He went to the University of Miami and got a degree in philosophy, which is not at all surprising now that I have finished James, because this is a book that is steeped in some really huge questions about philosophy, about ethics, about just some of the really fundamental questions of what it is to be human, which of course is the business of philosophy. But he also, in fact, studied mathematical logic, which I don't even really know what that means, but it certainly sounds impressive, and biochemistry. So this is somebody who is, when I said genius earlier, I was not really trying to be hyperbolic. This is someone who is really, really bright and someone who has immersed himself in some of the very big questions and really is making sense via language of a lot of issues that are really, really pressing and really sort of central, or should be central, in all of our lives. He then went on to get a master's degree at Brown in fiction. This is when I wonder about Wikipedia. They say he got a master's in fiction. And I'm like, was that an MFA? Was it actually a master's? What does it mean? What is fiction? And I could have done a little bit more digging, but honestly, there was so much to say here about both Percival and Huckleberry Finn that I was like, I cannot dig into what exactly his master's degree was. Needless to say, again, this is someone who is really, really educated and who has done a lot of thinking about language and philosophy and all of these questions that he is incorporating into James and all the rest of his oeuvre. By the way, he's someone who has written, I can't remember if it's 36 or 34 books, and these are wide-ranging books, everything from poetry, there's some visual art, there's, novella, there is short story, there is just all of the genres and all of the different ways that you can be really, really smart, especially given this medium of language. He is someone who is really doubling down on the importance of words and how we use them. It's my kind of writing, let me tell you. The Trees was published in 2020. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. That might be the next thing that I read. Although I'm also really wanting to read Erasure, which is the novel that American Fiction was based upon. So, and that was, I think, early aughts, like maybe 2002 or 2001 or something. So I'm excited to go back and read both of those because I just can't wait to hear more of this really smart man digging into some big questions. He now is a distinguished professor of something or other at USC, lives in Los Angeles with his wife, Danzy Senna, and they have 2 children. So I think he's like 67, 68 years old. He was born in 1956. So again, someone who is really, really steeped in all sorts of education, but who also wears it lightly. This is not someone whose work is ponderous. It's not someone whose work is, feels really heavy-handed. In James, we have Voltaire and we have Locke and we have these huge philosophers arriving, but none of it feels, it doesn't feel name-droppy. It doesn't feel contrived, even though honestly, honestly, some of the ways that he works these philosophers in are highly, highly unusual. But it's really, really just impressive and just absolutely delightful, which it's really hard to work in philosophers in a way that is delightful. Okay, so we've done our little bio of Percival Everett. We're now moving on to context. So I want to talk quickly about Mark Twain. Of course, he was born Samuel Clemens. I think most of you know that. He was born in 1835. So you want to think about his fiction as happening at the end of the 19th century. He was raised, in fact, in Hannibal, Missouri, which is where a lot of Huckleberry Finn goes down. And I really like, in fact, the melding in both Huckleberry Finn and in James of sort of real world elements that feel familiar. I mean, I have only been to Missouri once in my life, and I don't even think I saw the Mississippi River, but you have a sense of what that would look like. And the descriptions are so strong, certainly of the river, in both of these novels, that we have a sense of stories that are really based in a reality that we can imagine, and yet both are, again, asking some very, very big questions. And, in Huckleberry Finn, certainly, we have all sorts of adventures and all sorts of crazy stuff happening. But there's really this sense of being grounded in a place that is real, and in fact, the place where Mark Twain was born. So very famously, William Faulkner, whose novels were mostly in sort of the 20s and 30s, he called Mark Twain the father of American literature. Hemingway said something, I don't have the quote directly here, but it was something like, basically like there was nothing before and nothing good after the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I'm really stuck on the idea of that definite article, like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and then just Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I'm just like, really like, wait, what is the difference there? Like, it's clearly, a very intentional thing, but also, a very minor thing. So we have this idea of really revered American writers as seeing Mark Twain as doing something that was really foundational. And of course, part of me is like, wait a minute, this guy is the father of American literature, and his books, Tom Sawyer and Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, most importantly, were published in 1876 and 1884. So of course I was like, wait a minute, there were certainly important American writers that were doing very important work before those times. My mind went to Melville. I thought of Edith Wharton. We have Hawthorne. We have Edgar Allan Poe. We have a lot of poets. We have Walt Whitman and a lot of, Emily Dickinson, some very, very important people of letters who were all doing work before Mark Twain. And yet I think what people are responding to, and you have to take Hemingway with a grain of salt because he had that real macho thing going on. But he and Fitzgerald, that whole lost generation, I think they were looking to what Mark Twain was doing in particular with the vernacular. So I think what might be different, and this idea of like the birth of American literature, is that we were really hearing the voices of distinctly American people. So someone like Henry James, who had come before, or someone even like Edith Wharton, you're hearing American voices, but they really do share a lot with their European counterpoints. I used to always get confused. In fact, to be honest, I still sometimes do. I would be like, wait, Henry James is American, right? Like I would get confused because he feels very European. And in fact, he wrote a lot of books that took place in Europe. So you have this idea of people who were working in the United States, but who had a very sort of European air. Whereas Mark Twain, because he used the dialect and really leaned into the idea, it became a very important piece of both Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. So I want to take a quick look, in fact, at the beginning of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He says this: "Notice, persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot. By order of the author, per G.G., Chief of Ordnance." So this is so interesting. It's got this kind of nice meta thing. Like we're talking here, he's sort of pointing to the fact that Mark Twain has in fact created this sort of fiction, but then he's trying to guide us as to how we should be interpreting it. And it is a book that, because it's episodic and because there are lots of holes in the plot and it's sort of difficult to at times to really understand a through line, he's anticipating all of that and saying, don't look for a moral, don't look for a narrative, don't look for a plot. So even at the very beginning, he is being satirical. I think a lot of the controversy that arises over Mark Twain it has to do with the idea that people are reading it at face value instead of reading it like a satire. So this was something that came up when we were talking about Jane Austen, because Pride and Prejudice is a very different book if you read it at face value than if you read it as a satire. So it's important to remember that Mark Twain, throughout Huckleberry Finn, is satirizing people like Judge Thatcher and Miss Watson. And he's really satirizing a lot of the, the stereotypes that are brought up about Black people and about enslavement. It's very important to read it as a satire. It is, of course, also very important to look at the controversial elements of the book. I mean, the stereotyping is really awful. And, there's very, very liberal use of like the worst of the racial slurs. So I think there are some very warranted concerns about the novel, but I also think it's very important to read it as a satire. So we have to keep in mind the satire, but again, I want to return to this idea of dialect with the following. So he has the notice about like, don't look for a narrative or a plot or a moral. And then we have this explanatory note. It says, explanatory. In this book, a number of dialects are used, to wit, the Missouri Negro dialect, the extremist form of the backwoods Southwestern dialect, the ordinary Pike County dialect, and 4 modified varieties of this last. The shadings have not been done in a haphazard fashion or by guesswork, but painstakingly, and with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with the several forms of speech. I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many writers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding. The author. So Mark Twain, the author in this case, is sort of owning up to the fact that he is the one telling us, as opposed to this more tongue-in-cheek notice that has come just before. But what he's saying is extremely important. What he is putting into the novel is dialect. We are hearing actual voices, and in fact, he's pointing to all of these different dialects that are incorporated into the novel. He's delineating them, and he's talking about how painstakingly they have been put down. And, for someone who is not, familiar with these dialects, you could see where they would be hard to sort of separate and hard to discern. But this is enough. This sort of notice at the beginning is enough to remind us of all of the different ways that language is being used and all of the different dialects. So again, it was revolutionary, and this is, I think, what Faulkner and Hemingway in particular are responding to. It's really important to be able to have all of these voices heard in a novel that really is seeking to show the American, life in a way that perhaps Henry James was not. Okay, so now I want to dive in to the text itself. I love this cover art. I found it so really compelling. I mean, this was a book that really called to me from all of those tables in all of those bookshops that I frequent. In terms of the cover art, it's important to remember that authors don't usually have much to do with, in fact, their cover art. But I think this is really, really very, it's bold, it's important, and it's putting lots and lots of weight on the fact that the name, that James, is so important. And we have this idea here down at the bottom. I love the inclusion of the Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's also a Booker Prize finalist. I really hope that this book gets the attention it deserves when the next round of these awards come out. And I think it's important too that we have this very small illustration here that would have been taken, it looks to me, from some sort of depiction of Black people at the time. But certainly we have this idea of an enslaved person who is running away, or who at least is in motion, which really is at the heart of the book. But what is truly impressive to me is the way that the cover art, in fact, is underscoring the title. The title of the book, I think, is amazing. Names are very, very important, I mean, in general, but certainly all throughout this book. So, even with Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, the fact that those novels, that sort of the source material, was pointing, to a name. It was pointing to a single person, and it was focusing our attention on, alternately, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. So here we're very clear that we are focusing our attention on this one person, James, which is kind of revolutionary in its own right. But it's also very important that it is not Jim, it is James. So we have a renaming here that really gets to the essence of being able to have some autonomy and some kind of agency. I did my usual thing with titles where as I was going through the novel, anytime James, or sort of the name, the significant use of the name, not just like any random mention of James, but when it would come up and it seemed significant, I would mark it. And it was really, really strong the way that Percival Everett was underscoring the importance of this idea of James. So, and then it's, this is not giving anything away, but it is the last word of the novel. And I love the idea of it being, well, not, yes, it is the last word. I love the idea of beginning with this name and then ending with this name, and all the while throughout the narrative, really having it reinforced for us how important this name is. I also did love the fact that at one point a last name is included, and it is, the last name is Faber, which comes from a pencil. So a pencil, again, this is also not giving anything away. A pencil is a very important talisman and a very important plot point actually in the novel. And the idea of the importance of that pencil is underscored with this idea that James maybe would take on that name. You know, he's sort of trying it on at that point, but you do have this sense of choosing your own identity and shaping yourself in the way that you want to be as being very fundamentally tied to the name, which is extremely important throughout. So then we have our title, and we have our cover art, and we have our dedication. It says for Danzy, who is Percival Everett's wife. I again, haven't read any of the other ones, so I don't know who he is dedicating all of them to. Famously, Nabokov, you know, he dedicated all of them to his wife, Vera. I'm not sure if our Percival Everett is doing that same thing. I'll get back to you after I've read The Trees and Erasure. But this one is, in fact, dedicated to Danzy. And then we have this really interesting thing where what we are starting off here with is the notebook of Daniel Decatur Emmett. So I have to say that I found it very difficult to read this script. And it was not because I didn't have my readers. I mean, even when I had my strong readers on, I was not, it was taxing to be reading this script. And it was so interesting for me because it made me slow down and it made me appreciate the difficulties of reading. And I had this sense of like, I wonder how purposeful this is. I wonder how purposeful this choice of font is in terms of reminding us of the fact that it is in fact very difficult and it is a privilege to read. So I didn't know what these songs were, and I read through them, you know, I have to admit, pretty rapidly. And I did get a sense that they would have been songs from the era of Huckleberry Finn. And I did not, in fact, know any of these songs at the beginning. They were not familiar, but I really loved it when, in fact, we meet Daniel Decatur Emmett later in the text, and you're sort of like, oh my gosh, wait, here's the guy from the beginning. And of course, I went to the Google machine and looked up Daniel Decatur Emmett, and in fact, he is a very important songwriter and like very important part of the minstrel movement, which is highly, highly problematic because obviously those minstrels were white men who were wearing blackface and in fact doing lots of, you know, really hurtful sort of stereotyping of black people. But it was very, you know, I had that sort of like meta thing where I was like, oh my God, wait, this is the guy at the very beginning. And in fact, he is a real historical figure. So it really grounded the novel for me in the sense of things really happening. I also was totally alarmed because a couple of these songs like Jimmy Crack Corn, I mean, we sang that at summer camp, which is totally appalling. You know, also Dixie, like Way Down in Dixie. I don't remember singing that at summer camp, but I know the tune, so clearly I was singing it somewhere. And in fact, because the name Jim and James and Jimmy, because that seemed significant, I looked up Jimmy Crack Corn. And cracking corn apparently is like either idly kind of lying around gossiping, or it's cracking into like the corn whiskey jug. So there's this idea of an enslaved person, potentially named Jimmy. So the Jimmy Crack Corn, but I don't care, my master's gone away. So this idea of like, I can, even as an enslaved person, I can sort of lounge around all day gossiping, or I can lounge around drinking the corn whiskey or corn alcohol of some sort, because in fact, my master is away for the day. So I was so appalled because again, these are songs that are very familiar that I literally grew up singing and had no idea what the references were, which I think it's very important to have this kind of reckoning and to understand how casually that kind of, you know, song would have come down to us without any kind of real reflection on what in fact it meant. I had that experience also with bullying. So this bully and the bully whip is something that comes up again and again in the novel. And I don't actually know for sure that this is the case, but I was really alarmed at the idea that bullying someone, in fact, comes from the idea of this bully whip. I don't know that, but I was, vaguely sickened at the idea that that is where that comes from, the term bullying. I also, the idea of cakewalk, I mean, literally, I remember at an elementary school fundraiser that a cakewalk was a thing. You would buy a ticket and then, everybody would bring a cake and you would you would get a cake. But I had no idea of the origin of that tradition or the expression, it's no cakewalk. It's this idea of winning an easy prize. And I liked the idea that in the era in which James is taking place, that this was one way that the enslaved people might have been making fun of kind of the mincing and silly behavior of the enslavers. But it's, again, it's not sort of horrifying, it's totally horrifying that these are expressions and these are, cultural sort of traditions that we were doing, in the 80s, 70s, in the 70s, 100 years after, more than 100 years after this, and again, sort of without any reflection upon what they might have meant. So I really appreciated the way that Percival Everett, in fact, did a little consciousness raising for me as I was moving through the novel. So we have this idea of the notebook of Emmett, and that notebook, in fact, becomes very, very important as the text moves along. And it's really cool, in fact, to have it as a sort of epigraph at the very beginning of the novel. And lastly, including this Emmett notebook at the beginning, it also points to the fact that we are going to have inclusion of texts throughout the work. So we have different philosophers coming in, particularly philosophers, but we have these different elements that are sort of from the real world that are incorporated into the text, which is extremely important. It's not just like interesting in a literary way. It's not kind of just that like, oh my gosh, wait, this is cool because something, from the real world is incorporated into the fictive world. But there's also this idea of really widening the scope of the novel. So certainly philosophy is going to widen the scope of any novel, but when you're including, these songs that have such cultural, relevance in lots of ways and lots of really despicable ways, you're really adding weight, and you're adding, all of the history of what is implied in these songs and the oral tradition and in folklore and in the idea of the minstrel shows. I mean, all of that is then folded into the novel in a very economical and a really impressive way. It's not only like an interesting thing to do, but in fact, it's really serving a very large purpose in terms of adding veracity and adding this real sense of verisimilitude and adding this real sense of weight and gravity, which are really important because it's a profoundly historical text here that is playing off of a work of fiction, but is also looking at many of the other cultural manifestations of the time. Okay, now we're going to look at the first part 1, chapter 1. Those little bastards were hiding out there in the tall grass. The moon was not quite full, but bright, and it was behind them, so I could see them as plain as day, though it was deep night. Lightning bugs flashed against the black canvas. I waited at Miss Watson's kitchen door, rocked a loose step-board with my foot, knew she was going to call me to fix it tomorrow. I was waiting there for her to give me a pan of cornbread that she had made with my Sadie's recipe. Waiting is a big part of a slave's life. Waiting and waiting to wait some more. Waiting for demands, waiting for food, waiting for the ends of days, waiting for the just and deserved Christian reward at the end of it all. Those white boys, Huck and Tom, watched me. They were always playing some kind of pretending game where I was either a villain or prey, but certainly their toy. They hopped about out there with the chiggers, mosquitoes, and other biting bugs, but never made any progress toward me. It always pays to give white folks what they want, so I stepped into the yard and called out into the night. So this is such an incredible opening. So this is happening, toward the beginning of Huckleberry Finn. So he's settling into the house of the widow, and then it's like all sort of too civilized for him, and so he leaves. And he and Tom Sawyer are out, in the bushes, and they're having one of their adventures. And we have the whole thing from the perspective of James here. who is Jim in Huckleberry Finn, we have this whole thing about this very knowledgeable and very knowing presence where Jim is explaining to us not only, his relationship with Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, but also he's giving us some really important pieces at the very beginning here of what it is like, in fact, to be someone who is enslaved. So I think it really plays really well on this sense that the reader has of something that is very familiar. Whether or not you've read Huckleberry Finn recently, this is, you can imagine what these boys are all about. You can imagine, even just sort of in the popular culture, even if you've never read it, you have this sense of them as being sort of these pranksters and these young boys and sort of up to no good. I think you probably remember that they are not being closely watched by their parents. All of these different things are very familiar to us, but we also have this really important sense of him speaking in the first person. So whenever we have a first person narrative, it's important to ask why this person and why now. So if you ever decide to write something in the first person, you have to be able to answer those two questions. And obviously, in this case, it's really important and really cool that what Percival Everett is doing here is writing the story from Jim's perspective. So we have the first person as being kind of the very most obvious way to do that and the most, I think, telling. The first person can be very limiting in some ways because, in fact, the first person is I. So if you're saying I did this and I did that and I was sitting on the porch and I was looking at Huck and Tom out there in the bushes being bitten by the chiggers, as you have that first person, that I, it can be very limiting because really that first person narrator should only know what that person could know. But one of the beauties of this is that we as readers, ideally, if you have read Huckleberry Finn recently or you have listened to it in the audio version, you have this whole other world that is, informing your sense of what is going on. And also, Percival Everett just does a really great job of grounding us in elements of Huckleberry Finn as we are moving along. So lots of it can feel familiar. And even, I think some of us probably read adaptations when we were little, or there were a lot of versions of it that stripped out a lot of the parts that people thought were offensive, which, that's a whole conversation unto itself. But you have this idea of a lot of this. I mean, if you've been to Disneyland, I think or maybe that was only Swiss Family Robinson, but, in the popular imagination, there are lots of cartoons and lots of different things that sort of play on these elements from Huckleberry Finn. So you really have this sense of this feeling familiar. And so James, as having this sort of first person narrative voice, is not as limited as it might be because, in fact, lots of elements of the story are familiar to us. So one other thing that's really important about this first person narrative is that we learn fairly early on, at least in sort of the first third of the novel, that in fact James here is not just telling us the story, but in fact he is writing the story. So it's so cool the way that really this idea of this manuscript that we are holding in our hands is a product of James having written it. And on some level, as a reader, you sort of understand that intuitively. When he's talking about I did this, you're sort of, that he is telling the story, and that in some ways it was written because you have, you're holding this piece of fiction in your hands. But it becomes, in fact, very explicit. And it's one of the things that I think Percival Everett does so masterfully. So I want to take a quick look at this idea of the writing that is also happening. So this is kind of 1/3 of the way into the novel. And this is when we realize, in fact, that James is writing the book that we are holding in our hands. Often that kind of turn or that recognition happens at the very end of a novel. And I think that can feel a little bit cheeseball. It can feel a little bit like, oh my God, wait, the whole time this person has been writing the novel that I'm holding in my hands. So I like the way that Everett gets that kind of out of the way 1/3 of the way through. But I was so excited. I mean, those of you on YouTube can see right here, like down at the bottom with my marginalia, I have all of this stuff about, oh my God, it's James's story. Like it's very exciting to realize, in fact, that these are his actual words. This is not coming through a filter. In fact, this is what he is wanting to write. So I'm going to read what we have on 93. My name is James. I wish I could tell my story with a sense of history as much as industry. I was sold when I was born and then sold again. My mother's mother was from someplace on the continent of Africa, I had been told, or perhaps simply assumed. I cannot claim to any knowledge of that world or those people, whether my people were kings or beggars. I admire those who can remember the clans of their ancestors, their names and their movements of their families through the wrinkles, trenches, and chasms of the slave trade. I can tell you that I am a man who is cognizant of his world, a man who has a family, who loves a family, who has been torn from his family, a man who can read and write, a man who will not let his story be self-related, but self-written. So we have the big chunk of text, a big block of text in italics. We understand this is what James is writing. So here at the top we have this, my name is James. It's really important that he is beginning with this declaration of his name. And it's important that it's in italics, the whole entire block of text, because we understand that this is what he is writing. And then we have a little space break and we have the following line also in italics. With my pencil, I wrote myself into being. And then it goes on, that's part of the main text, and we go on. It's important, I believe, that this italicized part is also incorporated into the main text, because we are then allowed to believe that not only this chunk of text, but also the rest of the text that we are reading, these are James's words. So this little snippet, with my pencil, I wrote myself into being, that is a snippet that is repeated in lots and lots of the reviews of the book, and that is for very good reason, because this idea of writing himself into being is so cool. Not only is it very important because we have this first person narrative voice who is sharing the actual story of what has happened to someone who has been sidelined and marginalized in history, but we also have this idea on the importance of having this written document in our hands, the importance of writing, the importance of reading, the importance of listening to whose story is being told and discerning who in fact is the storyteller. So we have talked a lot at the Fox page about the importance of voice and this idea of who in fact is telling the story and in what language and in what registers they are speaking. And this is never more important than with this novel, James. So one of the things that Everett is doing so well is talking about the different languages that James speaks. And he talks about it in those terms. He speaks slave, or he can speak English that is actually his own language, which is also the language of the enslavers. So much the way that at the beginning of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, we have Mark Twain giving us this idea of dialects, we also have Percival Everett taking that idea and really making it his own. And in fact, alluding to the fact that white people expect to hear a certain verbiage and a certain syntax from the people they are enslaving. And when that doesn't happen, it's hugely disjointing and unmooring for the enslavers. I mean, even at the very end, in one of the most important climaxes, when a lot is happening in terms of potential violence, one of the elements that is so unsettling to the people, to the enslavers at that point, is the idea of language and is the way that in fact James is speaking. So even at the very beginning of the novel, we have this really clear sense of this kind of slave filter, which is one of the names that Percival Everett gives to James to describe the way, at times he talks about speaking slave, other times he talks about the slave filter. So there is this sense of the danger of not giving white people what they want, and there's nowhere where it is more apparent than when he is talking to his daughter. So very significantly, in Huckleberry Finn, Jim has 2 children, and it is really significant, in fact, that here in James, he is only described as having the one child, Lizzie. So his wife is Sadie, his daughter is Lizzie. They're named here, and it's very important, this interaction that he is having with her. This is on page 21. That evening I sat down with Lizzie and 6 other children in our cabin and gave a language lesson. These were indispensable. Safe movement through the world depended on mastery of language fluency. So we go down a little bit further. White folks expect us to sound a certain way, and it can only help if we don't disappoint them, I said. The only ones who suffer when they are made to feel inferior is us. Perhaps I should say, when they don't feel superior. So let's pause and review some of the basics. Don't make eye contact, a boy said. Never speak first, a girl said. Lizzie looked to the other children and then back at me. Never address any subject directly when talking to another slave. So he's making clear here, and in fact, he's giving us this whole sort of breakdown of what exactly the kind of submission that is expected by white people looks like. So all of the ways in which we would have heard Jim speaking in Huckleberry Finn is actually very codified here and explained to us in a way that's extremely important. So we have this idea of language as being really, really crucial in terms of survival and of safety. And this is not, it's not simply like changing registers or different dialects, and it's not as light as this disclaimer that Samuel Clemens has at the beginning of Huckleberry Finn. In fact, here we have, their lives are on the line. Like, it's a really, really crucial thing that these young children understand that there are expectations around language, and that honestly it can be the difference between life and death. So on page 52, this is when James has been bitten by the rattlesnake, which is taken directly from Huckleberry Finn. And in fact, I thought Percival Everett was very generous, because that is a trick that Huck Finn is playing on James. And it goes very awry and ends very badly for James. And in fact, Huckleberry Finn is not, he feels badly, but he's not as contrite as you would like him to be in Huck Finn. And I was waiting in James to have, Percival Everett really like unleash some real anger at Huck Finn for this prank that ended so badly for poor James. But in fact, it is very gracious in this novel, because in fact, it's more about the suffering that he goes through. So he's sort of delirious and is speaking in a register that wasn't comfortable for Huck. And so James is concerned about more of that happening. I was afraid to sleep again for fear of Huck coming back and hearing my thoughts without their passing through my slave filter. I was even more afraid of further unproductive imagined conversations with Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke about slavery, race, and of all things, albinism. How strange a world, how strange an existence, that one's equal must argue for one's equality, that one's equal must hold a station that allows airing of that argument, that one cannot make that argument for oneself, that premises of said argument must be vetted by those equals who do not agree. So what I love here is this idea of beginning with the threat of having, this young boy hear him, and even Huck's sense of his expectation of a certain accent and a certain dialect. But what's happening here is he's going one step further and talking about Voltaire, was it Voltaire? Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke, in these ways that are really important, because we're moving from this idea of language that is his own to the fact that he in fact has this enormous range, and to synthesize all of these philosophical questions that he is grappling with throughout the novel. In fact, I heard in an interview that Percival Everett, one of the ways that he sort of made his way into the character for James was this idea of coming up with his library. So in the novel, James goes into Judge Thatcher's library. He sneaks in and reads in there. But for Percival Everett, it was very important to imagine what those books would have been. It's really so cool. So not only does James, in fact, wield, all of these different dialects of English, but he also has this real sense of the way that language functions. So there are different times when he talks about metaphors. There are different times when he talks about satire and irony. And irony is actually something that comes up again and again. And I loved this sort of overt use of the term irony because of the way that Percival Everett is really underscoring the role of irony in the book. So I wanted to take a quick second and do a refresher for you on the differences between irony and satire. So irony is simply that something feels kind of strange because you expect it to happen one way, and often it happens in sort of the opposite way. So importantly, there's something called dramatic irony, which is specific to either the theater, which is where the word dramatic comes from. It comes from classical Greek, theater sort of stuff. But it also applies very much to literature and even to movies. It's this idea that the reader or other characters in the book have information that a certain character does not. And so much of James is sort of steeped in this idea of dramatic irony because we have all of the information from Huckleberry Finn. Some of us have more than others, that then we are bringing to James. So that idea of dramatic irony, the whole thing is sort of steeped in it. It pervades all of the different parts because as James, as things are unfolding in the novel by Percival Everett, we have in mind all of this sort of backstory about Huckleberry Finn. So, and oftentimes it even works with Huck too, because you have this sense of like, we know a lot of information that Huck doesn't know. And in fact, there's a lot of stuff that Jim knows that Huck doesn't know. So the dramatic irony is working on all sorts of different levels. So we have different shades of irony, and we're going to look at those in the text in just a moment. But satire is something slightly different. So satire and satirical humor or satirical writing is often exaggeration, or it's hyperbole, or it's a certain description that will show something about a character or a situation, and largely it tends to be corrective. So when we have these exaggerated portrayals, for example, of like how terrible Miss Watson is in Huckleberry Finn, or how terrible the king and the duke are in Huckleberry Finn, that is a very satirical look at these sort of con men who are in Huckleberry Finn. So when we have satire, it's sort of pointing out weaknesses in society in a way that usually hopes to be sort of corrective. So lots and lots of this book, of James and of Huckleberry Finn, are satirical, but I really loved the times when Percival Everett was underscoring either his use of irony or his use of satire. So very early in the novel, we have a really important illustration of how Jim is not the only person in this community of enslaved people who has access to this sort of philosophical thinking and understanding how language works. So he's talking with another enslaved person, Luke, and they're talking about how this guy's going to go off and get drunk. And James says this: "He's going to get drunk now, not so much because he can, but because we can't," I said. Luke chuckled. "So, when we see him staggering around later acting the fool, will that be an example of proleptic irony or dramatic irony?" "Could be both." Now that would be ironic. It's really so cool. I literally had to look up proleptic irony. I didn't even know what it means. It simply means that you know something is going to happen. So it's like, it's understanding that something is going to happen in the future, which this is an example of proleptic irony. And it's very close to dramatic irony, which is simply that idea that we, as a reader or as an audience, that we know something that the other characters don't. Or in this case, Luke and James know something that this other character doesn't know. So, but I loved this idea of these two different kinds of irony and the parsing, not only of like the literary terms, but how language works. It's so strong. On page 167, so this is when James, in fact, has joined up with the minstrel crew. And you have this kind of crazy visual irony here where he is, in fact, a black person who then is putting on some kind of white face and then putting on black face. So you have this very strange, kind of like convolution that is happening here. So, and Norman is someone who passes as white. I'm not giving anything particular away, but we have this Norman character who becomes very important in lots of different ways for the story. And the two of them, Norman is kind of the expert at doing this blackface makeup, and we have this interaction between the two of them. "Norman tucked a towel around my collar. 'Can't get this on your shirt.' He smeared the black onto my forehead. They even do the cakewalk." "But that's how we make fun of them," I said. "Yes, but they don't get that. It's lost on them. It's never occurred to them that we might find them mockable." "Double irony," I said. "That is amusing. Can one irony negate another? One cancel out the other?" Norman shrugged. This is actually not a terrible time to take a quick little sidebar. So The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn are both examples of something called the picaresque novel, a novel that is episodic, a novel that is sort of loosely tied together in these different sort of capers. And very importantly, it tends to be like some sort of a little young rapscallion, some sort of young like rascal person who is sort of doing things against the law, but in a way that is relatively harmless and sort of has their own set of ethics. So the picaresque novel, very importantly also, it generally doesn't show any change. So generally at the very end of the picaresque novel, the sort of impish, mischievous character is the same as they were at the beginning. So you can see why, in fact, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn are perfect examples of that, because these are not boys who are learning important lessons. Well, they do somewhat, but for the most part, they just carry on with their shenanigans. Certainly Tom Sawyer does, both in Huckleberry Finn. And Tom Sawyer doesn't figure as much in James, importantly, but you have this idea of Huckleberry Finn as still getting up to all the same shenanigans even toward the end of Huckleberry Finn. So we have that versus a Bildungsroman, which that is like a story of coming of age. So you have great, sort of evolution of a character from the beginning until the end. But James is then a completely different thing. It is neither picaresque nor any kind of Bildungsroman. It is really an incredible heroic quest in lots of ways. And we don't need to see like the kind of evolution that we would see in another character. James is very similar at the beginning as he is in the end, but he is in fact on the way to trying to overcome something really difficult. And we see him as sort of this hero, which is really very different in lots of ways than what we are seeing in both The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Okay, so we're going to move on from our discussion of irony to talk about humor slightly more generally in the novel. So the humor elements, I think it's really important because, again, there's a lot of weight to this novel. It feels very important. It feels very philosophical, and lots of times it's very difficult to read. It's dark, not difficult in the sense of the prose being difficult, but just it's hard to think about these realities. But the humor is often so perfect in terms of its levity, and it's dry, and it's subtle, and it's complicated, and it's just sort of woven in these ways. It's never, sort of heavy-handed, and it's certainly never like slapsticky or like really too obvious, but it's really, I think, serving a very important function. It also gives us a chance to move through the text and look at some of the ways that this prose is just unbelievably great. Okay, so on page 19, so I loved this because one of the elements of humor is the way that James and Percival Everett are both poking fun at Huckleberry Finn. There's a lot of that. So Huckleberry Finn, he's kind of an anti-hero in his own story, and in this one, he often just seems silly. So it's really delightful to sort of realize that like what's happening in Huckleberry Finn is often ridiculous, and you're sort of, as the reader, you're suspending disbelief, and you have a certain amount of sympathy and identification with Huck, so you're kind of going along with it. And then it's like such a relief when you're reading it in the pages of James to be like, yeah, this is absurd. So this is when Huck is telling James about the fact that when he was with Tom Sawyer, they had to do this blood oath. So Huck says this: "I'm surrounded by crazy people. You know what Tom Sawyer did?" "Tells me, Huck." "He made me take an oath in blood that if any of us tells gang secrets, then we will kill that person's entire family. Don't that sound crazy?" And I just had such a strong reaction to that. Here we have Huck confiding, in fact, in James, that a lot of what's happening in Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, even to Huck, sounds crazy. So you have this, it's this very intelligent thing that is sort of couched in humor. It seems light and just kind of cute on some level, but what's happening here is James is bringing out like a logical and a very important sort of critical thinking side of Huck that we don't have in Huck's own story. It's really very important and very rich the way that humor allows us to see this. Okay, on page 37, this is when Huck is telling James that, in fact, everybody thinks he's dead. "Jim, is that you, Jim?" It was Huck. "I swear, you like to scared me to death." "What you doing out here?" the boy asked. "First off, I'm freezing," I said. "What you be doing on this island? And why you got blood all over you?" "I killed myself," the boy said. I looked him over. "You didn't do a good job." Which I thought was so funny, shining this kind of spotlight on the ways in which this is absurd. This idea of like, oh, I killed myself. Well, you didn't do a good job of it. It just adds this whole other element that I think is really important and very well done throughout the novel. So there is just this sort of knowing and very sort of deadpan reactions on the part of James that are just so good and underscore the way in which Huckleberry Finn is being absurd, but also the sort of intelligence and warmth and acceptance on the part of James. On page 142, this is an example of the kind of like subtle humor that we have over and over. It is so effective. We have here, "Huck and I walked over to the pile of hay. We were near dead, but thankfully not dead." So this is, again, that kind of very subtle humor because, and in this case, it's really pointing to really the stakes being very, very high, and yet Percival Everett and James both having just a light touch with some of these really, really dark moments. It's not exactly comic relief, but a little bit, like just the slight levity in some of that kind of thing. And a lot of times it's playing with language. Percival Everett loves a pun. He has said, in fact, that he loves puns. He said that his humor is informed by his father, Groucho Marx, Mark Twain, and Bullwinkle, in that order. So I like the fact that Mark Twain is in there. I found Huckleberry Finn really amusing in lots of instances. And in fact, this kind of deadpan and kind of irony and kind of satirical, sort of sarcastic stuff is really, it's throughout, and it's light enough that it does add levity, but it's so skillfully done. Okay, then we move on to 160. This is when the minstrel people are wanting James to come with them because, in fact, he has a great singing voice. It's important that they're buying his voice, and that his voice is a kind of a commodity. It's really underscoring the fact that words are important and his voice is important. And in this case, it's this very strange and ironic and absurd situation where he is a black man who is posing as a white man, posing as a black man. Again, this kind of double irony that he spoke about earlier. But in fact, it's also ironic that what they want is his voice when he is someone who has been silenced. So when he is interacting with one of the minstrel guys, he says this: "Somehow he sounded more like he was practicing or even trying to make me feel comfortable, which was at once evidence of some sort of kindness and terribly offensive." So we have this idea of it was kind and also terribly offensive. It's not even like, it's definitely not laugh out loud funny, but there is a levity and a certain like sarcastic kind of ironic humor here that is really, really well done. Then a little further, so we come to another point where James and Huck, it's a very high stakes moment, and Huck says, "We have to stick together." And then James says, "That's not what we have to do at all." So again, you have this idea of really plain speak and of really stating, and it's also unexpected, which is part of humor. It's unexpected and it's clear and it's really cutting through a lot of what is happening in the novel in a way that I found, again, like a very important levity, but every single time it's smart, it's dry, it's subtle. It's my favorite kind of humor, but it is a very important element of the novel. I mean, it would be fine if it felt unrelenting, because it should be unrelenting in lots of ways. But if we're talking about a some sort of extension of the world of Mark Twain, there is a lot of humor in Mark Twain, so it's appropriate that we have even more skilled and interesting and subtle humor in James. So the last thing I want to talk about is this idea, before we talk about the very end, the spoilers that I promised and that I will very clearly announce before we get to them. But one of the things that the book does that I think is very skilled, I don't think it's the most important thing it does by any stretch, but I do think it's really, it's very satisfying, is this idea of answering questions that come up in Huckleberry Finn, or sort of clarifying pieces. Again, Huckleberry Finn is this kind of episodic novel, so you have these kinds of different chapters and different sort of sequences, and we have Huck Finn and James as being separated and then coming back together, and there are a bunch of different coincidences. And in fact, Huckleberry Finn has been pretty heavily criticized for sort of not hanging together very well. At the end of Huckleberry Finn, we have the reappearance of Tom Sawyer. And in fact, I got so frustrated at the end of Huckleberry Finn. I was sort of, I found Huckleberry Finn, listening to it, the audio version with Elijah Wood. I found it actually very entertaining. And I wouldn't be looking forward to it. I'd be like, I should probably listen to my Huckleberry Finn while I'm walking the dogs. And then I actually really enjoyed it quite a bit. But I will say that toward the end, I got very, very frustrated, because when Tom Sawyer re-enters the narrative, and James, or Jim at that point, is being held captive, and you just want the boys to free him. And there are a bunch of really easy ways they could do that. But because it is an adventure story, and because Mark Twain has promised his readers an adventure story, they like create all of this kind of like Rube Goldberg-esque kind of like complexity that is so frustrating. You have this sense of like, this is a human life that they're trifling with and that they are toying with. So that part got very, very frustrating for me. Like, it was so uncomfortable and terrible. And I just really was like angry actually at Twain and also at these young boys who were just kind of trifling again with a human life. So, but that is a part of the book that has been heavily criticized. And to his credit, Percival Everett just like eliminates that whole thing. Again, I don't think that's any kind of a spoiler. He just has an alternative thing and doesn't, in fact, involve Tom Sawyer deeply in the close of James, the novel. So, but there are a bunch of times where he answers some questions. For example, another one of the big questions that people have is like, why are they going south? Like, why is this escaped enslaved person moving toward the south? They get to a point when he could have gotten on the Ohio River, and he continues south in Huckleberry Finn. And in James, we have some answers, in fact, to why that is the case. We also, there's a whole episode of this big family feud thing that is happening in Huckleberry Finn. And so in James, we get the answers to some of the questions that are raised during that period of time. We also, in fact, throughout Huckleberry Finn, there is really, again, very liberal use of a really horrific racial slur. And that is addressed in James. And I was curious about how that was going to be handled. And I felt like Percival Everett does such a good job with that. So some of the elements of Huckleberry Finn that are really problematic are sort of dealt with in ways that I think are very skilled in the novel James. And one of the other things, I mentioned earlier that there's some coincidences. So lots of times when Jim and Huck are separated in Huckleberry Finn, you're sort of like, wait, why are they separated? And why are they back together? And this seems like overly coincidental. And those issues, some of them are addressed in James. And also you can imagine that in James, a lot of what we are finding out, a lot of what we are experiencing occurs during those periods of time when Huck and James are not together. And it's so satisfying, to sort of have Huck off in his world, and we know that he's off with the king and the duke, or we know that he's off, with the families who are feuding. But then to find out what James has been up to the whole time is so satisfying. So there are these ways that the things work together, and there's kind of this really nice filling in of gaps and answering of questions, which is very satisfying. So for those of you who don't want any spoilers, this would probably be a good time to pause the tape. And the tape, it's obviously not a tape. You can, hit pause on your like cassette tape player here. But you can, maybe tune in later when you have finished the book. For the rest of you, I want to talk, in fact, about a couple of spoilers. So definitely, I'm giving you some time here. Giving you some time. You should definitely be turning this off if you don't want to hear the rest of this. One of the pieces of the story that was so incredibly satisfying to me and so revelatory and so well done was this idea of Jim as being Huck's father. So this is something that is not alluded to in Huckleberry Finn. This is something that Percival Everett is really developing in ways that were so strong. And I have to say, this is exactly the way you want something like this to go in terms of the literary unfolding of it. So what you want when you are writing a novel is to have something feel really surprising, but also inevitable. So you want it to be like, the reader to be like, what? But you also want the reader to be like, oh my gosh, of course, like this makes so much sense to me because of different things that have been sort of different clues that have been included throughout. So if we look at the way that this is introduced subtly as we are moving along, it's very satisfying, and it's very cool to look at the care with which Percival Everett has laid this out. So on page 46, this is very early on in the book, and this is, I think most readers would not have any sense of this as being ironic. But once you have read to the end of the book and you understand what James's role is in Huck's life, this takes on whole new meaning. So at one point, Huck says, "I don't like white folks," he said, "and I is one." And then James says, "She'll look like one." So it's so important because, in fact, Huckleberry Finn is passing for a white boy in this story. But this idea of James, again, this dramatic irony here where James, in fact, knows that Huck is mixed race. James comes back with "she'll look like one." You have that idea of him as, tipping us off in a very, very subtle way relatively early in the novel. Then it gets slightly less subtle on page 150. The enslaved person is talking to James and says this: "What's the story with you and your boy? Did you teach him how to pass?" "What? How to pass?" Easter said. "Pass? Easter, that boy is whiter than Wiley." Easter smiled at me. "The boy doesn't know?" "Doesn't know what?" I asked. "I knew both of his parents." So we have this important introduction here on the part of someone who is Black and recognizing, in fact, that Huck, as a young boy, might, in fact, be mixed race. Later on, Huck says something about, when Tom Sawyer said that his hair never gets wet, there's this idea of sort of slow realization on the part of the reader that, in fact, Huck might be mixed race. But even here we have James sort of, pushing against that idea and saying, I know both of his parents, which is in fact not a lie, but in fact is not the whole truth. But this idea of passing too, which is, hugely important in literature. We have Passing by Nella Larson. We have we have Britt Bennett. I can't remember the name of that book. So then on page 253, my marginalia just goes completely bananas. So we're getting very close to the end of the novel. We have this really important revelation. I liked the fact that this is a very important revelation in the novel, but it was crucial to me that this is not a story about HUCK FINN. This is a story about James and his family, and it's about his enslaved family, about saving Sadie and Lizzie, and fully understanding that as a young white boy, that Huckleberry Finn will be fine in the world. So it's not, I didn't want it to become, a story where Huckleberry Finn is sort of, gaining more advantages and is suddenly has an even better life. I wanted it really to remain James's story. And in fact, he does a very good job of that here. So, as you know, having finished the book, here comes a spoiler. When he chooses to save Huck and not Norman, there's that incredible tension. And we have great tension throughout the novel. But there's that incredible tension of who's he going to save? Is it going to be Norman or Huck? He saves Huck, and Huck says this: "Why me, Jim? Maybe because I was tired of the slave voice. Maybe because I hated myself for having lost my friend. Maybe because the lie was burning through me. Maybe because of all those reasons, I said, because, Huck, and I hope you hear this without thinking I'm crazy or joking, you are my son." I mean, it's such a bombshell. I have, down at the bottom of my page here, it says, "What?" And up here, I have all these exclamation marks and stars and lines and whatnot. It was such a shocker, but I also had a sense that it was coming. Again, it's that sense of being surprised at how clearly it is stated, but also having that sense that this is inevitable. This is something that we knew, in fact, was coming. It's so, so well done. And of course, because Percival Everett is such a genius, and because this novel is so incredibly well done, this idea of Huck as being James's son is not just this cool kind of twist. In fact, it's extremely important because it's pointing up this fact of, of the way in which life is completely different for the son of James simply because he appears white. And all of the sort of ways that Huck would have to then grapple, with his race and with the idea of is he, in fact going to try to pass as white or continue passing as white? Also, again, this idea of James as really remaining resolved, toward the idea of saving his wife and daughter. The fact that is still the main thrust, and the fact that he is not going to have, much of a continued relationship with his son because he understands that his son will be safe in the world, is also hugely revealing about the sorts of choices that he has to make. So it's so incredible because it isn't just this kind of simple thing. It's this idea that's a very large question, and it sort of opens out into all of these large questions about race and about the idea of passing, the idea of enslavement, the idea of the Civil War. I mean, it morphs into all of these very, very important questions that the reader should be reflecting upon once we understand the reality that Percival Everett is positing here. It's so good. Okay, so and then I want to talk about the very ending again. Spoilers coming. So the ending I loved so much. I really wanted a happy ending, and I was really afraid that we were not going to get a happy ending. And I just I was so satisfied because it wasn't too tidy and it wasn't too kind of Hollywood ending, but in fact it was very satisfying to me, and really I think was a really good extension of the tone of the book. It didn't seem too Pollyanna-ish. It didn't seem too overly optimistic or too light. It was just, I felt it like it was earned and just really fantastic. So I want to take a look at the incredible prose and the ways in which these very last paragraphs of the book are so strong. So we have, this Graham farm where Sadie and the daughter are that have been sold to, and it's this horrific idea that this is this kind of breeding place. I mean, it's so dehumanizing and so awful to think that something like this would exist, and so it's really, really gratifying when in fact Jim is able to literally like burn it down. So this is when the owner of Graham Farms, or Graham, yeah, I think it's Graham Farms, comes out. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. He pointed his gun at me. I pointed my pistol at him. "I am the angel of death, come to offer sweet justice in the night," I said. "I am a sign. I am your future. I am James." I pulled back the hammer on my pistol. "What in tarnation?" He cocked his weapon. The shot I fired rang through that valley like a cannon blast. It echoed, seemingly forever. All of those with me stopped and watched the man receive the lead. His chest exploded red on his night clothes. He did not fall like a tree. Nothing about him was that big. He merely fell, face first, into a darkness none of us could see. The women behind him screamed, but their sounds were lost in the roar of the flames and the night. The wind became wild and stirred the fire. "Let's go," Sadie said at my arm. We ran. We all ran north, some up the road, some up the path. I carried Lizzie in my arms. She kept whispering, "Papa, Papa, Papa." It's so incredibly moving. That's not the very end of the book, but it's important to have this reunion of the three of them, but also the hellishness of the ending here. It's so beautifully done because we have the smallness of that man, and we have the idea of him as his death as being, not this kind of big monumental thing. It's like sort of an anticlimax, because it should be, because in some senses what's much bigger and what's much more important here is this idea of the enslaved people as being free. You, of course, though, have this idea of this kind of conflagration and this kind of hellishness and the blooming red, on the nightshirt. So all of that is speaking to the idea of the hell that these people should be in, these enslavers. So it's really, really beautifully done, kind of no nonsense, but just also lyrical and incredible in terms of seeing what vengeance James is having at the end. With something like this, as a reader, one thing to think about, if it's a fairly open-ended ending, if, for example, this book were to end right here, it would be a very open-ended ending. And when I am faced with that and I want kind of more clarity, or I want to know how the author is sort of predicting things, if you read closely, there's usually some sort of indication of what is going to happen in the future. So I thought this was very satisfying because, in fact, it is left somewhat open. It's not, this perfectly tidy ending, but in fact, we have reason to be optimistic. So here's the final chapter, chapter 12. It's very short. As happens with the frightened and unprepared, we scattered. Some of us would be caught, some of us would be killed. Probably some of us would go crawling back. Sadie, Lizzie, and I made it north to a town we were told was in Iowa. Morris and Buck remained with us. The white people didn't seem happy to see us, but there was a war on. It had something to do with us. The local sheriff met us in the street and regarded us suspiciously. "Runaways?" he asked. "We are," I said. "Any of you named N-word Jim?" I pointed to each of us. Sadie, Lizzie, Morris, Buck. So beautiful that you have this use here of this title, this name, this label on Jim that he is refusing in many ways, and he's giving the other people their names. And who are you? I am James. James what? Just James. So it's such a beautiful ending here. We have the idea of James as really coming into his own, and as, you know, this idea of a certain amount of optimism, the idea that they're in a state that is, you know, supposedly free, the idea that the Civil War is beginning and that, you know, people will be changing. The South will, in fact, be defeated. I mean, you know, the gains that will be made, in fact, will be not what James would hope, but certainly, you know, things are moving in a better direction. But you have here this idea, too, of him taking the name and he's stating his name and introducing himself, and of him as being like a self-creation, this idea of him as having agency and having identity and having a personage, having a name and something that he can present himself as by virtue of having been not only through this terrible trial, but as having written what he has written and having had, you know, this reunion with his wife and daughter. It's so, so strong. And I really love the idea of a somewhat open-ended ending, but also one that is incredibly satisfying because we are allowed a certain amount of optimism. So I loved this novel so much. I just found it so moving and so important. And I hope that this deep dive today has allowed you a little better understanding of why it is such an incredible literary feat and why it is also such an important addition to the way that we are looking at the American novel, and certainly the way that we are looking at Huckleberry Finn. Okay, thank you so much for listening and for tuning in, and I hope to see you back soon at the Foxed Page. Happy reading.